thank you very much for joining me today, guys.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you very much for having us.
So as I said, I hope Brian should be on to join us pretty soon, and I'll try. We typically have a one-on-one, but I wanted to do a panel today, and it was great that Jaime reached out. Jaime's been on a number of times as well on this issue to get Ms. Widdowson on, because you haven't been on the show before. Rod's been on at times, and you have a lot to add on this. And you, unfortunately, I guess, paid very dearly for daring to speak critically on this issue. Can you kind of expand a bit on your history with this?
Yes, so I was fired from Mount Royal University in December 2021. It wasn't directly due to my comments about the residential schools, but it was due to a climate where challenging certain ideas, which have come to be known as wokeism, which is identity politics, which becomes totalitarian, was becoming more and more difficult. And when I tried to talk about the residential schools, I got smeared as being a residential school denialist. And one of my colleagues even said, anyone who says that there has been any benefits of the residential schools should be fired. There was also a motion in General Faculty's Council, which is the governance body for the university, which passed a motion saying that genocide had been perpetrated against the Indigenous population. And when I objected to this and said, what about people who would question that view and did not accept that view? People said, well, you can dissent, but what happened is that it was increasingly seen as being an unacceptable viewpoint. And a similar thing happened with the residential schools. The ground penetrating radar discovery that happened in 2021 was our president put out an announcement saying that the bodies of 215 children had been found, and that all professors should, sort of aid residential school survivors in their grieving process. So to try to challenge that, to ask questions about it, ask critical questions, and demand evidence was basically increasingly seen as being unwelcome at Mount Royal. And Mount Royal is not very different from other universities across Canada.
No, we're seeing that problem all over, and I just found it very distressing with what happened with you. And for people who don't understand tenure, I kind of said that at the start of the show. I mean, the whole purpose of that system is to ensure that our professors and other people aren't afraid to delve into and at least critique and question things that may be controversial, and perhaps they're wrong, but you've got to examine and study these issues to come to a conclusion. And when we will dismiss somebody for examining those issues, the whole point of tenure has been completely lost.
Yes, and tenure is under serious threat. And for people who are worried about these issues, they should be very concerned about my case. It's going to arbitration in January of 2023. I'm pressing hard for that arbitration to be made public so that all the documents that are available with respect to my case can be examined, and we can begin to understand the problems that are occurring in universities with the clamp down on the discussion of these contentious topics, the unmarked graves, residential schools being, a couple of those issues, but it's not just those issues. It's a whole range of issues, which if you just say the wrong thing, you're going to have all sorts of complaints filed against you, and you're going to be dragged through various inquisitions, which will be intent on finding you to be guilty of breaching various code of conduct policies, harassment policies, and so on. So it's a very, very serious problem in universities today.
Yeah, and there's before I'm going to bring Rod on to speak to conditions in the residential schools as he spent some time on them, working in them. And just to point out with things such as Professor Widdowson had been pointing out, like I'm looking at a piece right now that has been cited, apparently, this is through Google articles, 72 times. It was written by Pam Palmater, and she's a very biased activist. I'll put it in a light way. And she wrote a piece essentially contending that the government was purposely trying to slaughter First Nations people in residential schools, in fact, by purposely exposing them to tuberculosis and other things such as that. It's unsourced, it's unrealistic, yet it gets taken as fact. And we need to have more academic discussion when stuff like this is going around out there. If this is true, then things are far worse than we ever imagined, but I strongly suspect it isn't. But so if we could bring Rod Clifton on from the panel there, and Rod, actually, again, as I said, spent time on the residential school west of or east of Calgary. That was the Blackfoot Reserve at that time, Siksika now, and you were up in Inuvik for some time. Thanks
Yes.
for joining us today, Rod, and maybe just kind of for the audience that didn't see the last time you were on, you know, you can say what Ms. Widdowson was punished for, essentially, that it wasn't necessarily all bad on these school sites.
That's exactly true. My parents-in-law, who went to residential school for 8 years, and my wife, who was in Old Sun Residential School for 10 years, they went to the apology by the Anglican Church, and in the middle of the week-long session out at Menaki Lodge, which is about 100 kilometers east of Winnipeg here, they phoned and said we had to come and pick them up because the emotions were so high they couldn't even get a reasonable discussion. So on the way back to Winnipeg, I asked my parents-in-law, well, what did you learn in residential school that turns out to be something positive? And my mother-in-law, without skipping a beat, said, I'm talking to you, aren't I? Meaning that they learned how to speak English. And if the Aboriginals didn't learn how to speak English, they couldn't talk to each other across the country. They need to have a common language in order to speak, and she recognized that. Now we've forgotten all about that. We've forgotten about, the fact that it wasn't until 1947 that tuberculosis was that a drug, streptomycin, that had a positive effect upon decreasing, helping people get better from tuberculosis was discovered, and we think that no children should have died as a result of any diseases or any difficulties that they had in residential school. We have to be more realistic about that.
That's it. And nobody's denying that, unfortunately, when you have a lot of children in a boarding situation in a number of areas, it's a sad reality of humanity. I mean, there's always nasty predators out there who were drawn to circumstances like that. There were individual cases of abuse. We've seen that in, Indian residential schools and in non-residential, or non-native boarding schools. It's a sick and unfortunate reality in life, and nobody's denying that it ever happened or excusing it. It's just that these stories have snowballed into as if, we label everybody who's attended even a day school now as a survivor, and the hyperbole is sort of getting to be too much.
My wife Elaine, when we were young, used to, when people said, "Did you go to residential school?" rather than saying yes, she would say, "No, I went to a private Anglican school." And now she doesn't even want to talk about it at all because of the tension and the difficulty of even expressing that concern. So she just keeps her mouth shut.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I mean, it scares people from even just wanting to get into it, and that's a sort of victimization in itself, in reality. But let's bring Brian in. I see he's joined the panel back there. Brian Giesbrecht, and we've talked about this, and I think I saw something else as I was reading up some stuff prior to this, and I saw another paper claiming that, because I believe you've addressed this when you've been on before, that there was no tuberculosis going around with children in the First Nations reserves, and they all picked it up while they were at the residential schools, and that's how it got them. But I mean, health conditions on reserves outside of the residential schools were not typically very good at all.
No, they weren't. Dr. Peter Bryce is usually the person quoted on these disease issues. He was very much involved with the residential schools in the early years. And what Bryce says is that the children would arrive at the residential schools infected with tuberculosis, and they would infect others, and that was just a fact of life. In fact, he did studies at 8 schools, and he found that every one of the children who was tested had the beginnings of tuberculosis when the child first entered the school. So it just shows how severe the problem was. And there was actually discussion. I've read discussions between officials at the time, school officials and government officials, and they said, well, what can we do about it? It wasn't as if they didn't know there was a problem, but they actually concluded that they would have to close down the schools if they insisted on a clean bill of health for every child. The fact was that the children, particularly the Plains Indian peoples, were very unhealthy at the time. The buffalo had disappeared. people were literally starving on the reserves. And some of the reserves, it was government rations that actually kept people alive. So health conditions were awful. And we also have to understand that 100 plus years ago, people got sick and died. That was just a fact of life. Now it's quite unusual for a child, for instance, to have to become infected with the disease and die. Well, that was commonplace at the time. The family that had 4 or 5 children with everyone living was the very lucky family. And Indians were particularly hard hit because the infection rate for many diseases, particularly tuberculosis, was very high. So death was just far too common. So I think we always have to factor that in when we're considering these issues, Corey.
Yeah, and you know, I like as I kind of said before the show started, going out myself and looking at things. And when I used to work in the Eastern United States, for example, in a lot of rural areas, I've always liked cemeteries. Actually, I just find them peaceful spots to wander and look around. But something striking when you go into those family plots and areas, and you look between 1920, and you'll see whole families that were wiped out. This wasn't First Nations people. This was people with the Spanish flu nailed. And you know, their children were very vulnerable to it and were often killed, and it was tragic. And we don't deal with that sort of thing today. But yes, I mean, due to a residential school, something like that would sweep through rather quickly. It doesn't mean there was a purposeful genocide. It just means they were in a poor environment at a time when the children were a lot more vulnerable.
Yes, it does. And I mentioned the actual number of children who died at residential schools was 832. Then there were some other children who died at hospitals later. And then the numbers have been added to that. But the actual numbers aren't out of line with death statistics at the time. They were quite normal and expected. The other thing that's really interesting about the deaths from tuberculosis at residential schools is that, yes, for a time in those early years, they were very bad, and probably residential school death rate was similar to what was going on at the reserve. But over time, the federal government and the churches did work very hard at residential schools to bring those numbers down. So in the 1930s and 40s, for instance, the death rate at residential schools then compared relatively favorably to normal schools or mainstream schools, while the death rate on reserves continued to be very high. And it's a shame that death rates were so high in reserves, but it was a fact of life. And the idea that residential schools were killing the children, no, diseases were killing the children, and those were the normal diseases of the day.
Maybe I could jump in and say something. I had tuberculosis meningitis, and I was in what was called a preventorium to prevent other people from getting it when I was a kid from 1946 to 1948, and it was pretty awful. I still remember a few of the things, even though I was only 2 or 3 years old, and it was full of kids. The sanatorium was full of kids, and some of them died. That's just the facts of life, and we forget, that Canadians actually lived through those kinds of situations. So we're thinking now that the conditions of today were identical to the conditions of 55 or 60 years ago. They weren't. They were much different.
Yeah, we can't measure against that lens at all. I mean, it wasn't relatively long ago that polio was wiping out children as well. And again, it wasn't exclusive to residential schools. So, speaking with Professor Widdowson, I mean, we're getting a lot of revisionist history going on, which is a dangerous trend going. And when we're quelling any discussion to it, I mean, our defenders against this should be in the halls of academia, and we're seeing that that's not working right now. I mean, how can we solve this? The only people we tend to see speaking out, we know that there's others who are silently thinking it but not saying it, tend to be retired professors or, unfortunately, in your case, a fired one.
Yes, well, we need to restore our universities to their academic character, and this is a big battle that's got to be fought. The most prominent organization in Canada that is doing that, I should mention, is the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. www.safs.ca. And the president, Mark Mercer, and the board, I'm a board member of that organization, and we are working tirelessly to write to university presidents, to hold events, to discuss these issues. So what is needed now is organization of academics at the local university level, at the national level through the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, and then internationally. There's many good organizations such as the Free Speech Union, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, and the National Association of Scholars. So this is really a work in progress, but many academics are opposed to what is happening. It's just that it's very difficult, because if you act as an individual, you will have all sorts of policies directed against you. And the important ones are harassment policies, human rights policies, and code of conduct policies. What's happening is, if you ask questions which a member who identifies as being part of an oppressed group does not like, they will charge you with harassment, and you'll have to go through an investigation on that basis. And that's what happened to me, is that I had to go through many investigations. I did nothing wrong. All I was doing initially was asking questions. And then when people tried to get me fired, I tried to defend myself from getting fired. And basically, I was told that I could not defend myself because I was sort of in opposition to members of groups that the university wanted to protect. So this is a major, major problem in universities, not just in Canada, throughout the Western world. And academics, if you're listening to this, we need to organize, and we need to fight back against these constraints on academic freedom and open inquiry in universities.
Absolutely. And, Jordan Peterson was mentioned earlier, again, whether people like or don't like, I mean, the way he was attacked for breaking from the orthodoxy, or God Sod is another gentleman who has written extensively on what's happening in there and covering it. And we really should be all very, very concerned with that trend. Another thing, I mean, not to sound callous, but in speaking with Rod, and that is a lot of the people who experienced the residential schools and had positive experiences are getting older, and we need to document those experiences from that point of view as well. And as you said, if people don't even want to talk about it anymore, they're getting shouted down. We're gonna lose the ability to document their experiences at these facilities, while we can.
For sure. And there's a lot of positive things that people have said about residential schools, those people that have actually worked in residential schools like I have. But nobody wants to hear their message, and they're not being phoned up and asked to do presentations at churches or at community clubs or whatever, to get the other side of the message out and to have a debate going on this issue, in the same sort of way that Francis is admitting that at universities you can't get a debate going in terms of the way people are being treated because of their ideological position or what they think are facts in a situation in comparison to what other people think are facts in those situations. And we need to have more of a discussion about these sorts of things. We simply can't listen to people say what they think went on, and any contrary evidence can't be brought forward.
Well, and that's it. Anecdotal evidence and oral histories, I mean, they're difficult at the best of times, but I mean, the best you can hope to get out of those then is to get as many people offering input from their experiences as possible. Because I mean, we certainly accept at face value a lot of the anecdotes from some people saying that there were babies hung up in basements and some pretty absurd accusations that get taken as fact. And then when somebody says, well, hey, I didn't think it was all that bad there, they get shouted down.
Right. Yeah, I never saw anything like that. My wife never saw anything like that, and her parents, in the 8 years that they were in Old Sun, never saw anything like that. I never heard anything like this. Now, of course, I knew about people being abused by certain people in residential schools because there were legal cases about that. But these other kinds of things are just nothing that I ever heard about. Now, it may be true, but we should have a good inquiry to find out whether it is it is true or not. And if it isn't true, then people shouldn't be spreading these false rumors around and destroying our society.
Well, yeah, and I'll go back to Ms. Widdowson with we want to find the truth. I mean, if indeed there were 215 murdered, buried children in Kamloops, and we just got a recent report that Jaime sent me from another individual that shows records that it's very likely there's a whole lot of septic tiles and things that were buried in that area where they found their anomalies. There's a very high chance there's not any bodies down there. Shouldn't we, though, be digging these holes as soon as possible? Because if these crimes happened, the perpetrators might still be alive, and we want to get them.
Yeah.
Yes, and Nina Green, who is a IF Stone figure, I should mention, has been tirelessly working and getting research on these matters. And really, there's three things that have to happen now. So the knowledge keepers, that's the only evidence that we have so far, is what's been the so-called knowledge keepers and their memories. And it's not like they're lying. Everyone says, oh, you're saying they're lying. We're not saying anyone is lying. It's just that memory, especially after many, many years, becomes, clouded. And as well, you can implant memories in people. So what has to happen is, first of all, there's a report that was done by the ground penetrating radar specialist, Sarah Beaulieu. And that report has been kept secret by the band. That report should be released. There's really no other things that have to happen at this initial stage, but that report has to be released so it can be viewed by outside experts. Then there was a RCMP investigation that was initially started, and Murray Sinclair became involved in cautioning Sarah Beaulieu to get a lawyer and to be concerned about answering questions in the RCMP. I don't know where that's at, but that should be reopened. And finally, excavations. That's the only way you are going to be able to determine whether there are remains there. And that should have been done a year ago. And for some reason, we cannot seem to get that going. And it really is... I don't understand why, if you think that there are 215 murdered children in an apple orchard, why the RCMP isn't starting this process of excavations.
Well, yeah, and I'd heard, again, a lot of emotional discussion from leaders in communities, and they take those quotes in the paper whenever it comes to these, is we want to get those remains and repatriate them and bring them to their families, but nobody follows up with the media to point out, well, where's the families looking for them? Where are they to be repatriated to? We haven't even found any remains yet. But the legacy media leaves that wide open, and again, our academia does. We've got a really travesty happening here right now, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better.
So I think one of the ways people do this is they just declare that both the ground and the report is sacred. And if it's sacred in the eyes of certain people, you can't open it for discussion in a general way, or you can't dig into the ground to find out what's there. This would be an easy out for anybody to claim, but certain people have a priority in making that claim and keeping other people from delving into finding out what the actual truth really is. And one of the perpetrators of this, of course, is the TRC Commission itself, who made certain claims that these areas are sacred and can't be violated. Well, I mean, if somebody's murdered, the police have an official responsibility to violate that principle, and because there's a higher order principle. That is, we want to find out who was murdered and how they were murdered and who's responsible, and hold them up for punishment.
So I see Brian's back in. I think perhaps there was a connection challenge or something there, and I'd like to. And Brian's got of course, an extensive legal history, because this is outside of my realm of knowledge. We were discussing, though, I mean, if we perhaps have this many bodies, or if it is happening, we should be seeing a forensic investigation. The reserves and others are resisting an actual, exhuming of these sites. Is there a way, though, we could legally force then? I mean, if this is a crime scene, if this is a forensic state, if I had one in my backyard, I couldn't tell the police, yeah, there's a body back there, but I consider it sacred, so I'm not going to let you dig it up. They're not going to take that. They're going to come in and dig it anyways. Is there a way we could compel further investigation on this to get some clarity?
Yeah, and I lost my connection. Sorry, so I don't know exactly what has been discussed here. But this is one of the big areas that Canadians should be discussing. What happened here? why we've got one of the biggest murder allegations in the history of Canada. We have the top chief in Canada, Archibald, claimed on BBC that tens of thousands of Indigenous students had been murdered in Canada and buried in spots all over the country. We have another one of our top Indigenous leaders claiming that there might be 25,000 and maybe more of these people. And the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation claims that there are thousands of missing children who went to school and never returned. So if true, this would be probably the worst, by far the worst crime in Canadian history. So you'd think that the RCMP would want to get right in there and investigate immediately, because if in fact it turns out, and I think it will, that Dr. Bolio's report is deeply flawed and that she was not detecting graves at all. Instead, she was detecting what was probably a sewage system built in the 1920s. And if in fact her report was done very incompetently, and as I say, I think that's what we're going to find. And if there are no bodies, if there are no murders, then the Canadian people have been through a heck of a bad year. The reputation of the country has suffered tremendously because we are now known as a spot where genocide occurred, where Indigenous children were murdered. And as I say, the research we've done makes it exceedingly unlikely that anybody, any child, was in fact murdered at a residential school. Other than one historical little footnote I'll tell you about in a minute, if I could. So the RCMP should definitely be, and what they should have done, I think my colleagues would agree with me, is immediately after this allegation was made, they should have taken over the investigation. They should have properly secured the area, and if necessary, they should have begun excavations, which would probably have consisted of, they probably wouldn't even have had to do so, because they would have found out after questioning Bolio and realizing that she had not properly prepared a report, they probably would have done the investigation, found that these were not graves in the first place, and they could have laid this to rest probably within a week of investigation, but they didn't do so. So the question that we have to ask is why? Now, what we know for a fact is that Murray Sinclair, who used to be the commissioner, the head commissioner for the TRC, contacted some people and said, lay off this investigation. Now, I'm not accusing Sinclair of doing anything wrong. He was a private citizen. I suppose that's his right to do so. But what happened next, we have to know about that, because it sounds like some important politicians got involved. And I'll see if my colleagues agree with my suspicions here. But it sounds like some important politicians got involved, and then they got on the phone to some very important RCMP people and said, don't do your investigation, stop, because you might be offending people or whatever the reasons. Now, for a politician to do that is very wrong. That's political interference at a top level. For the RCMP, if this is in fact what occurred, to simply not do their job and say, okay, well, we won't go and investigate, that is also very wrong. So I think what we have here is a political scandal, a very large political scandal that has not yet been fully explained. But yes, of course, the RCMP should have immediately gone involved and begun investigating properly, and this matter would have probably been laid to rest very quickly. And I don't know if my colleagues agree with me on that or not.
Well, we certainly need a report. We need to have Bolio's report released, and that makes no sense as to why that has not been made public. Yeah. And until we have that report released, no one should have, even proceeded on any of the discussions, but everything all blew up. And so now here we are. But the band must release Bolio's report.
Absolutely.
And I think, Brian, I would even push it a little bit further and said, there's complicity between the government, the churches, the RCMP, and particularly the media on this issue. So it's not simply, one sector of our society that's been bought off, but it's a whole swath of sectors of our society that aren't willing to open this to having a debate and try to find out what the actual truth really is.
And deference. I think that one doesn't necessarily have to get into the collusion or anything like that,
Right.
but there
Wow.
is too much deference for anything that a so-called knowledge keeper says when they're just an individual who has a memory, which could be flawed, could have been implanted. We cannot rely upon these memories to proceed in terms of our action. We need actual evidence, not just memories, which could have been implanted with some kind of suggestions, which has happened many times and happened in the 1980s with the Satanic Panic, which has a lot of similarities to what went on with respect to the Kamloops case.
Well, and particularly I went to a boarding school for a period of my young life. It's certainly not Indian residential or anything like that, but I remember the late night rumor mills between kids as they chatter and myths and things that are going on, and particularly in a boarding environment. And those things, if they aren't corrected, can even if it's not malicious, but inadvertently turn into what you think was a real memory later in life. It's not trying to cause harm, but I mean we're basing a lot of settlements, a lot of accusations on oral histories that are completely unproven.
Well, I think they're more than it even goes further than that. I think these are basically, my belief is that these are basically ghost stories. Originally, these stories about priests throwing babies into furnaces and killing people and secretly burying them with 6-year-olds and that sort of thing. These are basically ghost stories that probably frightened little kids in residential school dormitories told each other. And then they have been amplified. And we mentioned Kevin Annett, who is he's one of the most destructive people in Canadian history. He has taken these stories, these ghost stories that little kids tell, and he has made them more sophisticated and believable, and he's spread them throughout the country. So they have been floating around many indigenous communities now for decades, for a couple of decades. And they've created a type of, and I agree with Francis, it's a type of hysteria. And so you have these stories, and suddenly, for some reason, our own media and our own politicians go along with this nonsense. And that's what this is. Priests throwing babies into furnaces or secretly burying them with the forced help of 6-year-olds. Those are conspiracy theories, urban legends, whatever you want to call them, ghost stories. They're just not true. But these crazy stories have been conflated with the legitimate desire by some indigenous communities to search for the burial sites, long lost burial sites, and that's perfectly legitimate. But to have that conflated with all of these ghost stories has made a pure mess. And then on top of that, you have the media, which has not done its job. You have politicians who are forever, whatever the reasons are, exploiting this. And you've got indigenous leaders like Archibald making absolutely reckless statements. And they're doing great damage to the country, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, well, and so, I mean, before I let you guys go, I'll go one more round through, and I'll ask the hardest part, which is, how can we deal with this? How can we fix this? How can we correct this? Because it's only going to get worse. I mean, there's currently, as we speak, another GPR survey going on in a site up near Lac La Biche, and they said they're going to have results coming out this winter. Well, I can put my fortune teller's hat on already and tell you that they're going to say, we found a bunch of anomalies. Everybody's going to go hog wild. There'll be new settlements. There'll be new orange t-shirts springing up on fences all over the place, and nobody's going to dig up and follow through on whatever they discovered. And this is going to keep happening. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with you, Rod. Like, there are people like yourself who have been there firsthand. Is there any organization or more people coming to speak out and at least try to correct the record right now?
Well, we have a group of about 15 people that are looking, trying to look seriously into this issue, and we've got news outlets like yours and Epic Times and a few others that are concerned about that. So there's a group of about 15 of us that are trying to get the information out, but we're certainly not getting a sympathetic hearing from the other news outlets and looking at the issues that we're bringing forward. So until we start talking reasonably and sensibly and fairly to each other, I don't think we can move very much further.
Okay, well, we'll try what we can. And for
Yes.
yourself, Ms. Widdowson, I mean, you've kind of lost a bit of a platform for the time being, but you're still active, of course, outspoken, on the academic front. What more? I mean, there's lots that we want to see done, but what's being done or what can be done?
Yes, so I'm very active, and I have my own podcast called the Rational Space Disputations, where I invite people like Rod and Brian on to, have different perspectives aired. But really, university administration, what they are doing by making political statements all the time is they are directly acting against the ability of professors to critically examine issues. And this happened with the residential schools. It also happened with Black Lives Matter. Administrators and university presidents and so on should stay out of making these political statements, because what it does is it creates a chill for those who might disagree and gives you the impression that this is the official position of the university. And what happens if you question what's being stated is that you will have all sorts of complaints filed against you, that you are a person who is not aligned with the quote unquote values of what the university is about. The university is about the free and open exchange of ideas. It's not about having a particular political position. And this is a huge problem that exists. And if we can get rid of that problem and restore universities to a place of open inquiry, then we will be able to discuss issues such as the unmarked graves and the residential schools.
Great. And finally, Brian, where do we go from here?
Well, I think you're doing it, Corey, and I hope you will continue to do it. It's people in the media that we need. Terry Glavin's article was very brave, and he's paid a price. And John Kay at Colette. These are the people we need. Conrad Black, Barbara Kay. We need brave journalists that are prepared to take an honest look at this issue and not just write what their editors want them to write. And we have to have the editors of the national newspapers like the National Post and the Globe and Mail to get their heads out of their nether regions and start encouraging an honest discussion, not just having the authors like Tanya Talaga and these emotional appeals not based on facts. What they need is proper reporting. I mentioned Terry Glavin. There's a perfect example of an honest journalist. That's what we need, and that's what those editors have to do.
Well, great. Well, I thank all three of you for coming on to talk to me today, guys. It's such an important issue, and I appreciate your being outspoken on it. And as I said, all we can do is just keep hammering on this until hopefully we get good resolution in the long run. Because if we give up, well, then the misinformation is sure to win. So I appreciate the chance to talk to you all, and I hope I get to speak to you again all soon.
Thanks, Corey, and good luck in your new career.